You know what's wild? History books completely skip over one of humanity's oldest habits. And I'm not talking about gossip or complaining, I'm talking about smoking. What did our ancestors actually put in their mouths and light on fire? The answer is way stranger than you think, and it might change how you see ancient civilizations forever. Welcome back. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're about to uncover secrets that archaeologists have been quietly discovering in tombs, caves, and ancient ruins for decades. Secrets that museums don't really advertise. Let's start with something obvious but also completely wrong. When most people think of ancient smoking, they think of Native Americans and tobacco. Tobacco. That's the story we've been told. But here's the thing, the timeline doesn't work. Tobacco as we know it didn't become widespread across the world until the 1500s. So, what were people smoking for thousands of years before that? Because they were definitely smoking something. Archaeological evidence from sites in the Middle East shows that humans were inhaling smoke from plants at least 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years. That's not a passing trend. That's a fundamental part of human behavior. So fundamental that we basically forgot to document how widespread it actually was. Let's talk about China first, because China has some of the earliest evidence of organized smoking culture. And I mean organized. Around 2700 BC, ancient Chinese texts start mentioning something called burning wood and grass. Poetic, right? But that's not the full story. What they were actually doing was burning hemp, and not for the reason you might think. See, the Chinese weren't smoking hemp to get high. Well, not intentionally anyway. They were burning it for medicinal purposes. They believed the smoke could cure diseases, could clear the mind, could even communicate with spirits. And here's where it gets interesting. They were right about one thing. Hemp smoke does have compounds that affect the brain. The ancient Chinese doctors didn't understand chemistry, but they understood results. And people kept coming back, which means it worked, or people thought it worked. And in ancient medicine, that's basically the same thing. But China wasn't alone, far from it. In ancient Egypt, around 1500 BC, there's evidence that people were smoking something in their temples. Archaeologists found residue on ancient incense burners that suggests they were burning more than just frankincense and myrrh. They were mixing in plants we now know contain psychoactive compounds. Were they doing this on purpose? Almost certainly. Was it religious? Yes. Was it also recreational? Also yes. The Egyptians didn't really see a difference. Their religion was life. Their life was ritual. Their ritual involved a lot of smoke. Here's what gets me though. The Egyptians kept detailed records about almost everything, but when it came to what they were actually smoking in those temples, the records get vague, real vague. They use words like sacred smoke and the breath of the gods. You know what that tells me? They knew it was important. They just didn't want to be too specific about it. For someone reading this thousands of years later, there's a message in that silence. Now let's jump to Central and South America, because this is where things get genuinely wild. The Maya civilization was smoking something around 1000 BC, and we know exactly what it was because they documented it themselves. They carved it into stone, they painted it on pottery. They were smoking tobacco, but not the way you think. They weren't rolling cigarettes, they were using long ceremonial pipes. These pipes were works of art, ornate, expensive, made from jade and bone, and decorated with images of their gods. You don't carve something that elaborate into a pipe unless smoking is serious business. But here's the thing about Mayan smoking culture that blows my mind. It was restricted. It wasn't for everyone. You couldn't just walk into a Mayan marketplace and buy a bowl of tobacco. Smoking was a privilege of the elite, the priests, the rulers, the merchants. If you were a regular person, you didn't smoke. Well, you probably did, but you did it in secret, and you definitely didn't brag about it. This social hierarchy around smoking tells us something important about ancient human psychology. We've always wanted to do things we're told we can't do. We've always been willing to break rules to feel special. And power structures have always used substances as a way to maintain control. That's not new. We didn't invent that in the 1900s. We invented that about 5,000 years ago and just kept refining it. The Incas, living thousands of miles away from the Maya, completely independently discovered coca. Not for chewing into a paste like people do today. They were burning it, smoking it, using it in rituals. And because they were at high altitude where oxygen is scarce, the stimulant effects were absolutely crucial. Coca smoke helped them breathe better, helped them work harder in the thin mountain air. They weren't getting high for fun. They were using a chemical to survive in an environment that wanted to kill them. That's pragmatism. But wait, there's more. And this is where the story gets truly bizarre. In Africa, specifically in Ethiopia and the Arabian Peninsula, there's evidence going back thousands of years of people smoking something called khat. Actually, let me be more specific. They were chewing khat mostly, but the leaves also got dried and smoked. This plant contains an amphetamine-like compound, and I mean that literally. We're talking a natural version of what methamphetamine does to your brain. These weren't accidental discoveries. Ancient traders knew exactly what they were getting. They traveled enormous distances specifically to trade in khat. They built trade routes around this one plant. And those trade routes? They became the foundation of commerce between Africa and the Middle East. A plant that makes your brain fire faster literally shaped global economics. Let that sink in. In India, around 1500 BC, people were doing something that would have blown your mind if you could go back in time. They were mixing various plant materials together, creating blends, creating specific recipes. Smoking was becoming a craft, a science. There are Sanskrit texts that describe at least 17 different smoking mixtures, each one designed for different purposes, some for meditation, some for energy, some for celebration, some, if we're being honest, probably just to get weird. The Indians understood something that modern people sometimes forget. A substance is just a substance. How you use it, why you use it, what you believe it's going to do, those things determine the experience. And they were deliberately engineering that experience through careful selection of ingredients. Now, let's talk about something nobody wants to admit: addiction. Because we didn't invent addiction either. Ancient people got addicted to these substances, and we know this because they documented their cravings. They wrote about it, not as a weakness, but as a reality, as something that happened when you smoked for long enough. There are medieval texts from the Islamic world describing people who couldn't stop smoking, people who went to great lengths to get their substance of choice, people who experienced withdrawal. All of this thousands of years before we had a clinical understanding of addiction. They just called it a strong habit, or a sign of spiritual struggle. But the reality underneath the language was identical to what happens today. Here's what's truly fascinating, though. Different cultures developed completely different relationships with smoking. Some made it sacred, some made it recreational, some made it medicinal. Some made it illegal, at least for certain people. But all of them, without exception, had smoking. From the frozen wastes of Siberia to the tropical rainforests of South America, humans found plants and they burned them and they inhaled the smoke. Why? Why do we keep doing this? The answer is neurochemistry. Human brains want to alter their own chemistry. That's not a modern development. That's not a sign of moral decay. That's just what brains do. They're curious. They want to experience different states of consciousness. They want to feel different than they normally feel. And smoking is one of the most efficient delivery methods ever invented. You heat something up, the compounds become inhaled, they go directly to your lungs, They get absorbed into your bloodstream, and within seconds, your brain is different. That's fast. That's reliable. That's elegant. Basically, every ancient culture figured this out independently. And once you figure it out, you keep doing it. But here's the thing that keeps historians up at night. We're missing so much of the story, because most of what people smoked left no trace. If you burn something, it's gone. The evidence is smoke, and smoke disappears. So what we know is probably just the tip of the iceberg. The Neanderthals. Yes, Neanderthals. There's actual evidence that Neanderthals were smoking plant material. We found charred plant remains in caves where Neanderthals lived, evidence of controlled fire use around specific plants. And some of those plants have no nutritional value. Why would you burn them if you weren't trying to inhale something from them? You wouldn't. That evidence suggests that even Neanderthals, anatomically different humans who went extinct 25,000 years ago, were smoking. That's incredible. That's a behavior so fundamental that it persisted across different species of humans, across completely different evolutionary branches. So how did we get from ancient sacred smoking rituals to the anti-smoking campaigns of the 20th century? What changed? A lot of things. Industrialization made smoking way more efficient and way more accessible. You could buy cigarettes anywhere. Cigarettes weren't special anymore. They weren't sacred. They weren't restricted to the elite. Suddenly, everyone had access. And suddenly, instead of being a ritual, it became a habit. The psychology changed. When smoking was rare and restricted, using it was transgressive. It felt important. There was intention behind it. But when it became ubiquitous, it became automatic. People smoked without thinking, millions of them. And suddenly, the medical establishment started keeping detailed records. They realized that this ancient habit, when industrialized and mechanized and done all day, every day, actually kills you. Shocking, I know. But here's the irony. The solution wasn't to go back to ancient moderation. The solution became complete prohibition, or at least heavy regulation. We went from sacred ritual to casual recreation to public health enemy. That's a wild swing in just a few hundred years. And now we're starting the cycle all over again. Vaping, cannabis, hookah lounges. We're finding new ways to put substances into our lungs and brains, because apparently that urge is eternal. The ancient humans were onto something. Not necessarily the right thing, but something real. They understood that sometimes you want to experience your mind differently, and sometimes you're willing to pay a cost for that experience. This is the legacy that's hiding in plain sight. It's in archaeological digs that don't make headlines. It's in museum collections that are labeled vaguely because museum directors aren't sure how to explain what they found. It's in historical texts that use metaphorical language to describe something that was perfectly literal. Ancient humans smoked. They smoked a lot. They smoked intentionally. They built cultures around it. And they did it all without the specific knowledge we have now about what was actually happening in their bodies and brains. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What are we doing right now? What substances are we using? What behaviors are we normalizing that in 2,000 years people will look back on and think we were absolutely insane? Because history doesn't end. This is just another chapter. And whatever chapter comes next is being written by people just like us. People who will probably do things that future generations find baffling. But at least we'll understand the precedent. We'll know that this pattern has been going on since before civilization, since before writing, possibly since before we were even fully human. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about ancient history and the hidden patterns that show up again and again throughout human civilization, subscribe to the channel. We've got a ton of videos that explore how our ancestors weren't really that different from us. And that realization changes everything.